Of all the crises facing the United Kingdom today, there is one that quietly affects almost every household, every family, and every generation: the housing crisis. It's the reason so many adult children are still living at home well into their 30s. It's why rent now consumes an extraordinary share of monthly income, and it's why even people with what were once considered good, stable, well-paid jobs feel as though they are constantly falling behind. For many older viewers, this situation feels deeply unsettling because you remember a time when things worked very differently. A time when a single income could support a household, when buying a home required discipline and saving, but not miracles, when housing costs did not dominate every financial decision or define an entire generation's future. So what went wrong? Why does housing in the UK now feel so expensive, so insecure, and so unfair, especially when compared to the past and to other countries? And how did decisions made decades ago quietly shape the crisis we are living through today? That's what we're going to explain, calmly, clearly, and without political noise. If you value clear, factual explanations of the UK housing market, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to UK Property Report. This channel exists to help you stay informed, grounded, and ahead of the headlines. To understand the scale of the problem, we need to begin with one of the simplest and most reliable measures of housing affordability: the relationship between house prices and wages, specifically the ratio between the average house price and the average annual salary. For much of the post-war period, from around 1960 through to the late 1990s, this ratio was remarkably stable. The average house typically cost around 4 to 6 times the average salary. That wasn't painless, but it was manageable. It allowed people to save, to plan, and to move through life with a reasonable sense of security.
But as the UK entered the 21st century, that balance began to break down. House prices started rising faster than wages. Year after year, the gap widened. By 2021, the average house price in the UK had reached 9 times the average salary. To put that into historical perspective, the last time the house-to-wage ratio was that high was 1876, almost a century and a half ago. Since then, the ratio has fallen slightly, but not enough to restore balance. As of 2024, the average house price sits at around £290,000, while the average annual wage is just £37,600. That leaves the ratio at roughly 7.7, still far above historical norms. In practical terms, this means that since 1997, the average wage has roughly doubled, while the average house price has increased by more than 4 times. That single fact explains why younger generations feel locked out of ownership, and why many older homeowners now worry about the long-term sustainability of the system. Some may argue that this isn't unique to Britain, that housing affordability is a global issue, and to an extent that's true. Many developed countries are facing housing pressures, especially in major cities. But when we look at international comparisons, the UK stands out. According to the latest Demographia housing affordability data, the ratio between median house prices and median incomes in the UK is higher than almost every other English-speaking country. Only Australia and New Zealand perform worse. That means the UK is less affordable than the United States, Canada, and Ireland, countries that also face housing challenges. Another way to measure housing stress is to look at how many people are considered overburdened by housing costs. This refers to households spending more than 40% of their income on housing. In 2011, around 15.8% of people in the UK fell into that category. By 2020, that figure had risen to 19.9%.
Nearly 1 in 5 people, and crucially, this is around 12 percentage points higher than the European Union average. In France, only about 5.6% of people are overburdened by housing costs. In Germany, the figure is around 9%. Despite this, British homes are not larger, newer, or better quality. In fact, they are often smaller.
The average floor space per person in England is around 38 square meters. Compare that to 66 square meters in the United States, 46 in Germany, and 43 in France. Remarkably, people in England now have less living space per person than residents of New York City. On top of that, the UK has the oldest housing stock in Europe. A higher proportion of homes were built before the Second World War than in almost any other European country. Older viewers will recognise what that often means in practice: poor insulation, higher heating costs, damp issues, and expensive maintenance. So the UK pays more for smaller homes that are often older and harder to maintain. Why? A large part of the answer is surprisingly simple. The UK has not built enough homes for decades. At present, the UK has around 446 homes per 1,000 people. The European average is around 542 homes per 1,000 people. That gap represents millions of missing homes, and when you combine that shortage with population growth, longer life expectancy, and changing household structures, pressure becomes unavoidable. To understand how this happened, we need to go back nearly a century. In the 1930s, house building in the UK was relatively straightforward. Builders had access to cheap materials and affordable labour. Planning restrictions were minimal, focusing mainly on basic standards such as space and sanitation. As a result, house building surged. Between 1932 and 1934, annual housing completions doubled, rising from around 142,000 homes a year to nearly 286,000.
This rapid expansion eased shortages, but it also created anxiety about urban sprawl. People living on the outskirts of cities worried about endless expansion into countryside and farmland. Out of these concerns emerged the Council for the Protection of Rural England, or CPRE. Their influence proved decisive. The head of the CPRE, Patrick Abercrombie, was commissioned by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to write a report on regional planning and inequality. His conclusion was clear: cities should stop expanding outward and instead decentralise industry and housing into new, planned towns. These ideas were adopted by the post-war Labour government and embedded into law through the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. This moment fundamentally reshaped British housing. The Act introduced two major reforms. The first was the creation of green belts. Green belts are protected rings of land surrounding major cities where development is heavily restricted. Their purpose was to prevent urban sprawl and preserve open countryside. In that sense, they have been highly effective. Even today, only around 0.3% of greenbelt land is used for residential housing. By 2023, greenbelts covered over 16,000 square kilometres, around 12.6% of all land in England, more than double the area they covered in the late 1970s. The second reform was more subtle, but arguably more damaging. The UK moved from a zonal planning system to a discretionary planning system. Under a zonal system, developments that meet local land use plans are automatically approved. Under a discretionary system, local authorities can deny planning permission even when all technical requirements are met. This change gave local councils enormous power to block development. At the same time, because rationing was still in place after the war, private house building was restricted unless it was deemed to be in the public interest. Instead, the government focused heavily on public housing, especially council homes and new towns. For a time, this worked, but when public house building slowed, the system became reliant on private developers operating under a planning framework that actively discouraged local approval. Local residents had little incentive to support new housing. New developments meant more pressure on services, more traffic, and potential downward pressure on house prices. As homeownership expanded from the 1970s onward, more voters benefited financially from restricted supply. By 1971, the majority of UK households owned their homes. That meant a growing share of the electorate had a financial incentive to oppose development. The system stagnated. Then came another major turning point: right to buy.
Before 1979, council tenants could sometimes purchase their homes, but sales were limited. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher's government dramatically expanded the scheme. Tenants were offered discounts starting at 33%, rising to 50% for those who had lived in their homes for 20 years or more. Over time, more than 2 million council homes were sold. For individuals, this was often life-changing, but structurally it came with a severe cost. Councils were not allowed to keep most of the proceeds. The Local Government and Housing Act of 1989 required councils to use up to 75% of the revenue to pay down debt. They were also prevented from using most of the money to replace housing stock. Only around 2% of homes sold under Right to Buy were ever replaced. Council house construction collapsed under both Conservative and New Labour governments. A 2019 Greater London Authority report found that around 42% of homes sold under Right to Buy in London eventually ended up in the private rental market. The UK shifted from providing subsidised housing through public ownership to subsidising private landlords through housing benefits. More low-income households now rely on local housing allowance, but over the past 13 years, that allowance has been frozen in 8 of them. The result is that the poorest households increasingly have to make up the difference themselves. By the government's own admission, the UK needs between 225,000 and 275,000 new homes every year. Since the 1970s, it has averaged around 160,000. Some estimates suggest that if the UK had built at the same rate as comparable European countries from 1955 to 2015, there would be around 4.3 million more homes today. Government policy also increased demand without fixing supply. The introduction of buy-to-let mortgages in the 1990s encouraged investors to buy homes that might otherwise have gone to first-time buyers.
Later, Help to Buy injected billions of pounds into a supply-constrained market. Originally intended as a £250 million scheme, it ballooned to around £30 billion before being wound down in 2022. Studies found it pushed up prices without significantly increasing construction. The result of all this is the housing market we see today, a system shaped not by one decision, but by decades of compounding policy choices. To their credit, the current government has acknowledged that building more homes is the only sustainable solution, but progress remains slow. They are still far from their target of delivering 1.5 million new homes. Until supply increases meaningfully, pressure on prices and rents will remain. If this explanation has helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, please like this video and subscribe to UK Property Report. We focus on calm, factual explanations of the UK housing market, especially for those who want clarity, not noise. Thank you for watching.